Screenwriting for Hollywood, Part 5. Now, we're ready to move to the fourth and final stage of the process, and that is scene writing. And you may recall that, in the beginning of this course, I said that audience and reader are synonymous. In other words, the way that a screenplay elicits emotion in a reader is the same as the way the movie elicits emotion in an audience. But I said, there was one exception, and this is the exception, in the way you put the words on the page. Because in the movie, there are countless things that are going to either enhance the emotional experience for the audience or dissipate it. In other words, things like the direction, the performances of the actors and actresses, the cinematography, the editing, the special effects, the art direction, the sound editing, everything that everybody gets credit for on the movie is going to either increase or decrease the emotional involvement of the audience. But as a writer, you don't have access to all of those tools, but those filmmakers have. So, you must do all of those things they're able to do with only one tool, and that is the dictionary. You must use the language to elicit that same kind of emotional response in the reader that a movie has all of those people to accomplish. And, therefore, your primary goal as a screenwriter, in the way you put the words on the page, is to create a vivid movie in the mind of the reader. In other words, anything you do that makes the process of reading your screenplay fast, easy, and enjoyable is to your benefit. On the other hand, anything you do to slow the reader down, to call attention to the words on the page, or to remind the reader that he's reading a screenplay, works against you. So, the first thing to be concerned about, as far as the scene writing is concerned, is the way you present your script. It's just a professional presentation. First of all, before you ever submit your screenplay to anyone, proofread it extensively. Better yet, get a friend to proofread it who's very good at that, who wasn't so close to it, or it'll be easier for them to miss a spelling error, a punctuation error, a typographical error, and so on. Any script to submit to anyone in power, an agent, a contact, an executive, or reader, whatever, must be pristine. Next of all, you want to be sure and check it for proper format. I'm not going to go through all of the rules of format now, because they are easily accessible in countless books in the Screenwriter's Bible. Just keep in mind that the format you use in your screenplay is the format for a proposal script, or what is sometimes called a submission script. In other words, you should eliminate things like scene numbers, camera directions, parenthetical directions, sound effects placed all in capital letters, the word continued at the bottom of each page when the scene continues, because those are shooting script devices. In your presentation, the scene heading, at the beginning of each scene, should identify only the location and the time of day. It should not include character names, it should not include descriptions, it should not include camera directions, like, angle on John. Or, it shouldn't say, exterior Central Park John and Mary walking. That's the action. Just, exterior Central Park day. Then, in the action, you would put John and Mary are taking a walk along the bridle path, or whatever. You should omit all references to the musical score or the credit sequences from your script. Even though you may have a clever idea of how the opening credits are shown, omit, get right into the action of the movie. And the same with the musical score. It is not your job to decide what the background music will be. Now, I know that you have the perfect idea, you know the perfect composition to symbolize these two people falling in love, and there's this perfect Barry Manilow song that would just be great, laid under on the soundtrack there. Forget it. It's not your job. Begin and end the scene with action and description, not dialogue. Never begin a scene with dialogue. The first thing we read should be the wide margin paragraph that describes the setting in some way and tells us who's in the scene and describes the action if they're doing anything. And finally, you are allowed only one setting per scene. The definition of a scene is action occurring in a separate time and place. That means, anytime you change the settings for the scene, it requires a new scene. Meaning, either changing the location or jumping ahead in time. So, if the scene is occurring in John and Mary's apartment, and then you pick up their conversation when they're now down in the parking lot, it's a new scene when they're in the parking lot. You can't squeeze in two locations or two periods of time within a single scene. Okay, so that's all sort of stuff about how you actually present the scene, how it's laid out on the page. Now, as far as what happens in the scene, with regard to the plot of the scene, the first thing you must do is figure out, what is your goal in this scene? Or, how does it connect to the hero's outer motivation? The foundation of everything in your script is your story concept, is your hero's visible desire, and every single scene in your screenplay must somehow contribute to that hero's outer motivation. Either move the hero closer to it, or create more obstacles to it, or at least the anticipation of more obstacles to it. There can be no irrelevant scenes. So, the question you must ask is, what must you accomplish in this scene to move the hero closer to the goal she's pursuing, or to create more obstacles to it? The next consideration is, each character within the scene must now have an objective. Remember, desire and conflict is at the core of all storytelling, of all drama, of all movie writing. Desire moves the story forward, conflict gives it emotion. So, every character in every scene must want something, or else there's no movement. It's static. But, an equally important consideration is to then figure out how are these individual characters' goals in opposition. Because, remember, desire moves the story forward, but it is conflict that gives it emotion. So, almost without exception, every scene in your movie will have two or more characters in conflict. There will be occasional exceptions, such as when characters are working together to face some other obstacle, or when they're falling in love, or there's a moment of rest where they're getting along before the next obstacle is faced, and so on. But, by and large, every scene in your movie will have characters in conflict. Think about any scene in any movie that you liked, that you vividly remember, and my guess is, two characters wanted opposite things in that scene, and that's what made it memorable and emotional. When you create a scene, you want to enter the action as late as possible. What that means is that, when you know what your goal is for the scene, you want to begin the scene as close as you possibly can to the moment where that issue will be faced and dealt with. We don't need to see a lot of preparation for that, a lot of unnecessary movement toward that particular thing. Come in as close as you can to that moment. Next of all, the scene should contain action, not just dialogue. Hollywood is not looking for talking heads movies. This is particularly important if you're writing a feature film, or a 1-hour episode, or a TV movie. They're called movies because they've got to move. So, the first thing you want to ask about anything, after you decide what your goal is what are the characters doing to get closer to this goal? Then think about what they're going to say. Next thing you want to do is maintain credibility in the scene. Make sure that the characters are behaving the way people with their backgrounds would normally behave in this situation. So many movies fall apart because we just don't believe what the characters are doing or saying. Mostly we don't believe it because it hasn't been established early enough that they would do such a thing. But, make sure that you've justified the characters' actions earlier, so when the actions seem important, then we can believe them. And always ask yourself in every scene, is this the way these characters would normally behave? Is this believable? Is the audience gonna buy this? But again, foreshadowing is a wonderful tool to make a character's behavior believable. Next of all, the scene must play out in real time. In other words, whatever you put in the scene that is going to happen has to be shown on the screen. I have read a lot of screenplays that have scenes like this. Let's say, the character's just gotten out of the military. That's off the bus for his homecoming, after the war, at the corner of his old neighborhood, of his old block. Gazes down the block to the street where he grew up, walks down the street, comes to his old home, where his mother is sweeping the porch, she drops the broom, rushes out, and gives him a hug. Okay? Sounds like a very ordinary scene. Bad, bad, bad. Why? Because what I just said is, we are going to watch that guy walk an entire block. Because it's all in the same scene, and the scene must play out in real time. You can't cut within a scene. It's a new scene if you jump in time. Now, I know when I read those things, the writer envisioned that we'd watch the guy get off the bus, he'd gaze down the street, cut to the home, and then we'd see him walk up the walkway to his house. Because we've seen that scene in 112 movies. But if you don't write it that way, whatever you say the character's doing must be shown on the screen. Cut out all the extraneous stuff. And finally, you want to lead the reader into the following scenes. The last thing that happens in the scene must leave us hanging in some way, unless it's the final scene in the movie. Because, if you don't compel the reader to turn the page, the reader doesn't want to know what's going to happen next. You've lost them. They're only gonna turn the page if they feel like they have to, because they gotta find out. Okay, now what's going to happen? In Thelma and Louise, I gotta wait and see if they get to Mexico. And in Unforgiven, I've got to see if he changes his mind and decides he does want to go with the cowboy and trying to get the reward. The next thing to concern yourself is with the writing style itself. What kind of language do you use to describe all this action? And the first thing to realize is that screenwriting language must be simple, concise, and easy to read. Remember, your goal is to create a vivid movie in the mind of the reader by making it fast, easy, and enjoyable to read the script. Screenplays should be written at a high school reading level, which of course nowadays probably means a junior high school reading level. And the other issue with style is, nothing goes on the page that doesn't go on the screen. You can only tell the reader what the audience would know as they're watching the movie. And this is a rule that is broken in almost every screenplay I critique. At some point in the script, the writer lapses into novelty, you might say. She feels a knot in her stomach every time she sees him and is subjected to his repeated put-downs. That would fit into a bad novel fairly nicely. Okay? Can't put any of that into a screenplay because I can't see a knot in her stomach and I have no information about these put-downs other than what the writer tells me. And the audience would have no way of knowing any of those things. If you're going to write that in a script, you have to do it in terms of description of the character, or action, or dialogue. So, if I see her face tighten up as soon as he walks into the room, or if I hear her say a line of dialogue, "Ooh, another put down, what a surprise, John," then I get the sense that this has been going on. You can't tell me anything as the reader that the audience isn't going to know as they watch the movie. And you have to check each scene with a fine-tooth comb for that. As far as the description itself of character and setting, the first goal in any scene is to pull the reader into the scene. Pull the reader into the setting. So, before you describe characters, certainly before you give characters action or dialogue, tell me where I am, tell me where we are in this scene, where is this occurring? Not just, it's in John's apartment, because if I've never been to John's apartment before, I want to know what it looks like. Not only because it creates this vivid image in the reader's mind, but because it can also convey to the reader something about John. And this is especially important when you open your movie. Because at the beginning of the film, you have to pull the reader into the entire story, and the reader is somewhere miles away. They're resenting the fact that they have one more script to read, believe me, and they're thinking about that they'd rather be playing tennis, and they're stuck at home on a Saturday reading scripts, and they're nowhere near the setting of your story. So, if you jump right into it with one brief sentence saying, you know, John is a 44-year-old man, and then give John a line of dialogue, they haven't had any chance to get their bearings. And it works against you. You want to describe all the settings and all the characters in detail. When I say detail, I don't mean on and on and on and on in some excessive way. I mean picking 2 or 3 of the most appropriate details to create that vivid image and to convey the essence of the character or the setting. You can paint a vivid picture in very few strokes, as long as you pick the right brush strokes to do so. When you describe the character himself, the first thing to think about is, what is the character wearing? Don't worry about how tall the character is. Unless you're writing Space Jam, it really doesn't matter how tall a character is. And I know your heroine is a beautiful 22-year-old buxom blonde, because they all are, in most of the scripts I read, and that's irrelevant. Unless you're writing a movie where it's particularly important, like it's about, you know, a stripper or something like that. Age and build and stuff like that is probably irrelevant and works against you because it could limit casting possibilities. Instead, think about what a character is wearing, what a character's gestures and habits are, and how they move. In other words, a character who looks like she just stepped off the pages of Working Woman magazine is different than the one who just stepped out of the pages of Vanity Fair, and she's different than the one who just stepped out of Cosmopolitan, or whatever. It's that person huddled against the wall, you know, eyes darting to other people. You could even chill a little and say, terrified that someone might come up and talk to her. Or does she burst into a room, all eyes turn toward her, she goes right to the center of the room, and is immediately surrounded by 4 men, who serve much different characters without ever resorting to age, or height, or build. Okay? And finally, as I mentioned, you want to maximize casting possibilities. Because you want as many bankable stars to be able to play a role you created, especially the major roles in your movie, as possible. You don't want to limit casting by specifying exact age, exact height, and so on. Next of all, when it comes to writing the action in your scene, again the writing must be clear, vivid, and emotionally involving. That's again where simplicity works best. It is much more important that I understand what's happening in a scene than that I'd be impressed by your use of language. Clarity is one of the most difficult things to achieve in any form of writing because you never know exactly whether you're getting across to the reader what it is you envision. But if you think again about detail, are you saying exactly what's happening, using simple concise language, and accounting for every character in the scene, and describing it in enough detail that we can envision what we're watching? Next of all, brevity is highly regarded in Hollywood. When you write action, keep the paragraphs short and either break them up with dialogue if there is dialogue in the scene, or if there's no dialogue, double space between, and have a lot of short paragraphs rather than one lengthy paragraph. And finally, you've got to describe everything that happens in detail. You can't shortcut the action writing. In other words, you can't say they jump into their cars and there's an exciting car chase. Because the only way a car chase can be exciting is if you tell me everything that's happening on the screen in an exciting way. Every screech of brakes, every squealing tire, every swerve, every crashed into a garbage can, every car rolling down the cliff, whatever it might be. If there were one summary thing I would say about writing action and description in your screenplay, it would be, take your time. Because the biggest problem I see with screenplays, repeatedly, is that the writers do not allow themselves sufficient time to draw the reader in and to detail what's going on. When I say take your time, I don't mean spend time, I mean allow yourself enough pages to say what's going on, particularly when you open your movie. You've got 10 pages. 10 pages to grab the reader means you've got to get the reader emotionally involved. It doesn't mean you've got to haul ass and get him involved within page 1. That 10 pages is 10 pages you can use to pull the reader out of their real life and into your story, so allow yourself time to do it. And then, we come to the dialogue. And first of all, when you're writing dialogue, make sure that you have introduced the character into the scene where the dialogue occurs before you give them a speech. The character's name should never, ever appear above dialogue without that character's name having previously appeared in the action paragraph of that scene, even if we met the character before. If this is a new scene taking place in a diner, then you've got to say, John and Mary sit across from each other at a table eating French fries before John can't say, these are too salty. Dialogue should reflect the character's background. In other words, whatever job your character has, whatever education they've had, whatever region of the country, what their ethnic or racial background is, all of these things will affect their speech patterns, just like it does in real life. This is one of the advantages of researching the script. And one of the ways you do research a script, and that is, you hang out with people who have or are in the same situation as your characters. Okay. There are certain qualities of dialogue that weaken the dialogue that you want to try and avoid. One is on-the-nose dialogue. On-the-nose dialogue is dialogue where a character says exactly what she thinks and feels and means. It's bad dialogue. Because nobody in real life says exactly what she thinks and feels and needs. We all tap dance around our true feelings, sort of tiptoe up to what our desires are. It is very difficult for anyone to directly say, I want this or I feel this. The solution to on-the-nose dialogue is dialogue with subtext. Subtext means that the true feeling, the true emotional content of the character is underneath what is said. So, when Frasier says to his father, would it be so hard for you to say thank you just once? And instead of saying, no, it's too hard for me to express my emotions like that, he says to his dog, come on Eddie, it's time for lunch. The subtext is, it's too hard for me to express my feelings, but the text is, asking his dog to come have lunch. So, you want to think about what is the emotional content of the scene, but then think about how can you relegate that to subtext and create text that is more original and more realistically the way people talk. The next consideration in writing dialogue, avoid trite dialogue. This is something I don't have any suggestions of how you do that. If you know what cliches are, you know what you've heard in 100 other movies. It's quiet out there, almost too quiet, you know, I mean, just don't do it. Think of the most original way you can to convey what is probably an emotion, or desire, or a statement of exposition that we have heard in other movies. And also, avoid formal dialogue. Most people speak in contractions. They don't say, I will not, I cannot, I shall not. They don't all sound like John Gielgud, so unless you're writing about someone who actually is an English butler, give them normal speech, slang expressions, contractions, and complete sentences sometimes, and so on. And, finally, avoid verbose dialogue. Keep the dialogue crisp. Hollywood loves crisp, but clever dialogue. Clever meaning, original, avoiding these other things. Fun ways of saying things that we've heard before. You want your dialogue to be as interesting and original as you can. Now again, it's impossible for me, at least I've never been able to think of a way to tell you how to do that without actually hearing it and helping you come up with other ways. But, as a general rule, the first time you write a scene, just write whatever comes to you, even if it is trite, or cliché, or verbose, or on the nose. And then look at it and say, now is there a better way to do this? Is there a more clever way? How can I convey this more subtly? How can I convey it more succinctly? How can I make it more appropriate to the character? Next of all, make sure the dialogue complements the action, doesn't duplicate it. Don't tell us what we've already seen. There's an exception to this, however, if added emotion that we're curious about will be created by seeing the character's reaction. In other words, if seeing a person killed in an auto accident provides action in a movie, but seeing our hero's reaction to learning of the character's death is going to create a different kind of emotion that's also important for the audience to see, then of course we would need to see the dialogue where that character was informed of the person's death, or whatever is being revealed to the character. And finally, make sure you're using as many of the checklist items and principles I gave you before with regard to character identification and structure. In other words, can you introduce dialogue that echoes something, that foreshadows something, that creates anticipation, that creates curiosity, that surprises the audience? And also, using the devices to reveal character growth and theme. Because it's through dialogue that inner conflict, inner motivation, emotional fear, and theme are revealed. Because those are all invisible qualities of the character in the movie. So, as you're doing successive drafts of the film, not the first draft probably, but in successive drafts of the scene, look at those other checklists to see. Have you employed as many of those principles as you can?